Hello, this is Dr. Harriet Fraad, here with the podcast Capitalism Hits Home, brought to you by Democracy at Work. This podcast hopes to show you the mutual shaping interconnections between personal life and race, class, culture, and capitalism itself, because unlike many in the psychology profession, I can see that the things that impact us and shape us personally are not just our families, but are also the economy, the culture, our race, our class, and all the other things in our culture that show us what life is. And I hope that I can elucidate that in today's discussion. What I want to talk about today is the concept of cruel optimism. Lauren Berlant wrote this book, Cruel Optimism, which is much too hard to read. I prefer people who actually read to communicate rather than show their scholarly colleagues just how well read they are and how carefully they footnoted all their thoughts. However, the concept is a very interesting concept because Americans, of all the world's people that I know of, are supposed to be, quote, happy. And there has been an optimism in our culture, an optimism built on the idea that for a long time, for 150 years, from 1820 to the 1970s, if you were a white male or in a family headed by a white male, every generation could do a little bit better than the generation before them. There were opportunities. There was a big middle class. There were chances to advance. There were very strong possibilities that your children would do better economically than you did. And so people had this idea, it will happen for me. I will do okay. I will do well. I will have a stable job. I will have a stable marriage. I will have a stable family. I will have a stable home. I will have a place in society, and particularly men who were the providers for these homes and who were the top of the economic heap if they were white. And of course, not every single one. And of course, some minorities succeeded, but these are general dominant trends. Those families could have a sense that we will have a good life, the good life, good stable jobs if we're men, good stable families if we're men, women, or children. Our kids will grow up and have opportunities. And that security went throughout. We will have secure romantic responsibilities and romantic possibilities. We'll have secure health, and we'll be able to meet our 5 basic human needs thanks to the fact that we live in America. We'll have adequate food. We'll have adequate shelter. We'll have clean water. Our food will be healthful and nutritious. We'll be protected from extreme heat and extreme cold with proper heating units and, if possible, air conditioning. We'll have rest and restorative sleep. Now, we have to figure out what has happened now that people's optimism has become cruel because those expectations are not met. And the society teaches people, if you're not in a happy marriage, particularly women, it's your fault. You're not kind enough, you're not skilled enough, you're not sexy enough. If your kids aren't flourishing, you did something wrong. If your marriage falls apart, you did something wrong, particularly women who've been assigned the responsibility for personal life and children. And for men, if you can't provide for your family, you've done something wrong. The patterns that used to be prevalent only among African families, African American families, with a lot of absent fathers who could see that they couldn't support their families and were ashamed and left and abandoned their wives and children. Now, most families fall apart because the economy has changed and there aren't those possibilities for stability anywhere. Also, as far as a good life with advancement, that's largely over. During the pandemic, it was really most strongly illustrated. In 1970, the US was the most egalitarian of all the developed nations. Now we are the least egalitarian. We have the most separation of those at the top and everyone else. The pandemic is a great illustration. During the pandemic, top salaries, the top management salaries, went up as much as 1,000%. The 10 billionaires at the top of our society, there are more than 10, but top 10, between them made a $440 million profit, while the mass of people, salaries went down, opportunities went down, and so that they were further immiserated. People struggled. In the 60s and early 70s, one man made a family wage if he was white. And that family wage could support a dependent wife and children. Now, two people working full-time have a lower standard of living than that one man who was white could provide. In fact, in 20 states in the United States, $7.25, the minimum wage, is the wage that is given to entry-level workers who don't have a college education. And a couple or two people living together, making the minimum wage and working full-time, and even with a little overtime, can't afford to rent a 2-bedroom apartment anywhere in any city, state, or county in the total United States. Those wages, if you count inflation, have gone up 3.3%, whereas the wages at the top during the pandemic have gone up 63-point-something%. I think it's 63.4%. So we see diverging possibilities of the top and the bottom. What happens to people when this optimism that they've had about a secure and happy life, secure and decent job, and marriage and home, turns out to have been a cruel disappointment? Well, it's affected men and women differently. For men, particularly white men, there's been the biggest letdown. In fact, millions of white men are driven into desperation. Overdoses are up 30%. Shaken baby syndrome, which is where you're so angry at a baby's crying that you shake it till its brain turns to jelly, and that it can go blind or deaf or dead during that shaking. Child abuse is up, wife abuse is up, alcoholism, drug abuse, all the signs of desperation and misery are going up. life expectancy is going down. People are dying younger. And there's the whole phenomenon that Case and Deaton so meticulously document in their book, Deaths of Despair, where white women in poor areas in the Midwest and in the South are dying earlier than Black women, even though Black women are poorer. And that's because their idea of being supported in child rearing in a home provided by the family wage of men, that's over. And their marriages are largely over. In the United States, in 1965, 25% of marriages ended in separation or divorce, legal separation or divorce. They don't count people who just split. Now, it's between 65 and 75% of marriages end in separation or divorce. 50% end in formal legal separation or divorce, but between, I don't know, about 15 and 25%. And because people don't want to spend the money on a legal divorce or a legal separation, and they don't have children to fight over, or money to fight over, or possessions to fight over, so they just split, make an agreement, and just split. 75% of American children don't live with their biological parents. And because men can't support women anymore, it's women who usually refuse marriage, because the old model that men want of a wife who takes care of them sexually, who takes care of the family emotionally, who takes care of the children, who cooks and who cleans and who does social reach out to relatives and friends and family, that's over. Between the feminist movement and the necessity of women to work outside the home and women's reluctance to come back home for a second shift, as Arlie Hochschild calls it in her book, The Second Shift, a second shift of labor, and men who have those ideas that that's what women should be doing for them want even more emotional labor from women to compensate them for the fact that they can't make the kind of living that they identified with manhood. An interesting study shows that in married couples where the woman earns more than the man, which is 39% of couples, women do extra housework to reassure their husbands that they're still kings of the house. They're still real men. And still unemployed men in a couple do less housework than their fully employed wives, if they have them. And so that there is this transitional period, which is particularly hard on men. Women's optimism can still be somewhat buoyed, held up, because where there's a divorce or separation, women, first of all, are making higher salaries than we used to because we're allowed to be in more jobs. Women's liberation, feminist movement has fought for job equality so that we can enter jobs we were forbidden and excluded from. Even though sex abuse does keep women from entering male fields, like the STEM fields where women are routinely abused, the military, which has a huge rate of sex abuse, or in certain factories where women try to be on the factory floor and are so sexually harassed that they can't stand it, because sexual harassment is a way of asserting male supremacy over women. And although the Me Too and Time's Out movement have had an effect, it's still prevalent enough so that 43% of women still work in pink collar, that is, overwhelmingly female jobs. But even so, because we have done better than we used to, because the ideology for women, the culture of women has changed, so white women have some of the independence that Black women had to have economically. 40% of American children are now born outside of a marriage. And so that women who want children but not husbands have children outside of a marriage, which is more and more acceptable as a possibility for women. But this also excludes men. So women's lives are much harder than they used to be because women still do the majority of the domestic work, either for themselves if they live independently, or themselves and children if they live independently with children, or for men if they live with men or are married to men. They still do the bulk of the, about 75% according to the Time studies. Women still do about 75% of the cooking, the cleaning, the shopping, the responsibility for the household, the responsibility for childcare, the responsibility for social connection with a couple. They still do that, but we are also, more and more of us are single. The majority of American women is now single. The majority are single, which means that marriage has had a sea change. It used to be that only the smallest minority of women were single. But now it's the majority. And that also leaves men out because men are rejected from one of the tokens of their manhood. American men's manhood used to be defined by the fact that they had good, stable jobs, if they were white, and the vast majority used to be white. That is changing, but that was so. And they had stable marriages, a stable, reliable woman to take care of them. Well, that isn't happening anymore. And the optimism that men had, yes, this is my lot in life as a male, has had a terrible, painful readjustment. Now, one of the tokens of manhood that is widely advertised is owning a gun. As I have probably cited before, but it bears remembering, is that the ad for the Bushmaster automatic weapon, and Bushmaster has a kind of double entendre here, unintended perhaps, and perhaps intended. The ad said, before they took it down because of feminist outrage, does your wife or girlfriend earn more money than you? Revoke your man card. Do you prefer tofu to meat? Revoke your man card. Do you stay home and provide childcare? Revoke your man card. And then after this longer list, there's a picture of the Bushmaster automatic weapon, and it says, reinstate your man card. Because guns are another accoutrement of masculine power. And that accoutrement was truly wielded as insecure men used it over the 4th of July weekend. Over the 4th of July weekend, 230 people were killed by guns wielded by men. 618 people were injured by guns with men using guns. It's one of those last stands where men who feel that they've been emasculated. And I must say that there was a wonderful map in the Wall Street Journal, which was then copied in Mother Jones magazine, that juxtaposed the Trump-supporting counties and states with those showing the greatest insecure masculinity and gun ownership. There was a perfect match. That those men who collect guns and swear by their guns are more likely to be using testosterone-enhancing creams, getting penis extenders, and so on. Because people in ads, there's Clint Eastwood, make my day, standing there about to shoot somebody in the head, are tokens of powerful masculinity, which men admire. And in their desperation, they use, even if it literally kills them, as well as all those other people. It's also a token of such desperation that one is completely narcissistic. You can get out there and kill people without thinking about, wait a minute, what would that feel like to all the people who care about the person killed? What about that person's life? That disappears. Because when people are extremely depressed or extremely angry, they're totally self-centered. All they can think about is their own misery, or their rage takes over them. And they can't think about the effects of what they've done. Otherwise, there would be no shaken baby syndrome. Men wouldn't beat up their wives when they come home feeling bad. They wouldn't shoot people because their pride is hurt over a small slight. People are shot over somebody taking their parking space or bumping into them. Or there are many incidences of violence in New York because the pandemic brings out both the best in us and also the beast in a lot of people, particularly men whose prospects are dimmed by this recession that came along with our pandemic that has not been cured. And so they reassert their masculinity through guns. And men are in particular trouble because the optimism they had about making it in society, making a good living, having a woman there to serve them when they get home, having kids they could be proud of, meeting with other guys and watching a game on TV while their wife serves the beer and the chips. That's over, by and large. And that cruel optimism that was part of our culture, that you can make it if you really try, without the aside, and you're white and male, but still, that you can make it. If you can't, of course, it's your fault, has come home to roost. And what has happened is that the explanations largely available blame the individual, unless they're, of course, right-wing, where you blame uppity women who put you down, or people of color who are ostensibly taking your job, even though they're doing a whole lot less well and getting fewer jobs, and refugees, forgetting that basically all of us in the United States were immigrants. The only people that were not immigrants were the Native Americans, who have been treated the worst of all, who are the poorest people in America economically, and who did not get the vote in every state in the Union until 1965. Pretty impressive. But they're objects on which to blame the disillusionment, the anger, the pain that capitalism has delivered, which is a personal pain. And of course, the newspapers and television Fox News is the most popular television, is not showing people your standard of living has decreased because capitalism gets workers to work for cheap, where they have no ecological protections, where they don't have any retirement benefits, sick days, health insurance. And they're making more money. And the fact that things are computerized makes it even easier for them. And so the money that you are making, while you often endanger yourself, particularly during the pandemic, is making someone rich who's nowhere nearby. A perfect illustration is Jeff Bezos, perhaps the richest man in the world, who made a killing, well, lots of killings in lots of different ways, during the pandemic, where people were crowded together in his warehouses, doing dangerous jobs of lifting in a time span that was truly injurious to keep up, and were in improperly ventilated spaces and too close together, and so were afflicted by COVID, and then given 10 days sick leave. And after that, Bezos, in his ultimate generosity, gave them the ability to borrow sick days from other workers rather than extend their sick leave because of COVID. And so hundreds of people died, and Jeff Bezos could spend $500 million amusing himself by going into space, along with other rich passengers who enriched themselves off of the labor of other people. And within this disaster, the explanation given by our capitalist newspapers and by certain right-wing ideologues like Murray, M-U-R-R-A-Y, in his book, Coming Apart. He blames the laziness of working class men and their lack of morality and sexual fidelity for the breaking apart of marriages and the immiseration that comes from single mothers and children and from lower wages. And of course, he was very popular with the rich for writing that book. And that's really interesting because in 1965, Patrick Moynihan wrote a study of the Black family in which he found Black men were pathological, that their families fell apart because they were lazy and because they were immoral, not because they couldn't be what was considered a man at that time and provide for their families with the low wages that they received. Within this economic disaster, Americans have been disillusioned. Many women are sustained by our own connection because women have been the social connectors, and we are connecting with each other through Time's Up, through Me Too, through progressive candidates who are overwhelmingly women, people like India Walton, who's the mayor of Buffalo, Black woman, people like Cori Bush, a Black woman who now represents Missouri. It is women's time to gain power and economic clout and our rights. The two most militant unions in the United States are the nurses union, overwhelmingly female, and the flight attendants union headed by Sarah Nelson. And that too is an overwhelmingly female union. It's men whose optimism has turned them cruel, indifferent, If you looked at the January 6th Capitol invasion, it's overwhelmingly a male event with the Proud Boys, notice, not the Proud Girls, and the Boogaloo Boys, and the military men, and the police men in attendance because they are angry and upset that they've lost the tokens of masculinity that made them feel like men, the ability to earn the kind of living that allowed them to have a full-time female servant in the house, doing the domestic work, bearing and rearing the children, and doing the emotional work of helping them feel good, and the social connection with their children, with their relatives, and with their friends. And they are not given the kind of explanation that capitalism has exported their jobs and immiserated their jobs and robotized and computerized their jobs. And they need to join with women of all colors and races. They need to join with everyone so that we can win. Because we are the majority. We keep America going. And we could win if we had something that compares to an umbrella, with the central post being class solidarity, that those people who do the labor should get the rewards here. And then all the other movements joined in like the spokes of an umbrella. The Black Lives Matter, because of course, all lives matter, including Black lives. The Me Too and Time's Up and women's rights movements and abortion rights movements. The transsexual movement and every other progressive movement, including, of course, the climate movement. Save Mother Earth. Save our planet. Unite with us, with the central spoke, the central handle being class solidarity. And so, to sum it up, the optimism bred in America's prosperity is a cruel optimism in today's reality, and people are reacting to it. Of course, we want your feedback on this, and I thank you so much for listening. This podcast was made possible by Democracy at Work. Please support us if you can. If you have extra money that you could use to support this podcast, it would be wonderful. At Patreon, patreon.com, Capitalism Hits Home, or visit us at democracyatwork.info, looking for Capitalism Hits Home, because listening is your biggest contribution. Listening and sharing this podcast. And of course, this is capitalism. We would deeply appreciate your dollars as well. I want to especially thank Brian Issam, who does the photography and the sound and is amazing, and Maria Carnamola and Liz Phillips, Rick Wolff, and the whole team at Democracy at Work for making this podcast possible. Our Twitter handle is Democracy at Work. Instagram is at Democracy at Work. My website is www.harrietfraad.com. Thank you so much. Goodbye for now. We'll be back next week.